this PROTA, Plant Resources of Tropical Africa organization, is mainly an African organization with headquarters in Gabon, Ghana, Kenya. There was a contact person here in Tanzania as well. And unfortunately, the organization, I will come back to that, has run out of funding, but it has been able, with substantial funding of the International Tropical Timber Organization, to produce 2 books on African timbers. And Hans Beekman sitting there, and Nedevoto Molel sitting over there, and myself had the honor to be involved in that project. And I'm just going to tell you about the wealth of information that's in these 2 books on timbers from Africa. I will bring these books with me tomorrow because I thought it was only my turn tomorrow, so you can see them. But everything which is in those books is also available freely on the web. I must acknowledge the fact that I'm borrowing heavily from a PowerPoint presentation prepared by the Dutch coordinator of the editorial office of PROTA in Wageningen, Roel Lemmens. So just, and I think in this light you probably can't read it, but it doesn't matter. These are just some not so recent ITTO statistics showing that the production of logs, sawnwood, veneer and plywood in the ITTO countries, and Tanzania is not an ITTO country, but that is not small beer. That is, there are huge volumes of timber and huge values in export of timbers going around in this continent. So this is a picture of the book I will be talking about. So Timber Volume 1 and 2 together cover 1,200 timber species in 500 review articles. There are 2 hefty books altogether, 1,500 pages, and they were published in 2008 and 2012. This is just a breakdown of the number of species treated in those volumes. We recognized major timbers, really the big things like the African mahoganies, etc., of which 270 species are treated. The minor species, altogether 324 species. And then there are species in the same genera as these major and minor species, another 600 species. So that brings the total of 1,200 to 1,200 species. It was a huge team effort to bring together that information. PROTA, like its sister organization in Southeast Asia, PROSIA, Plant Resources of Southeast Asia, had as mission to bring together in a user-friendly way all the published information on these tropical tree species and their timber products. And you can imagine, if you come from the forestry world, that a lot of that information is in the so-called grey literature. It's in national reports of forest research institutions. It is in obscure journals. And the major task and beauty of both PROSIA and PROTA is to bring this together in a well-organized, standardized form so that it is available for any user of knowledge on the trees and their timbers. So we are talking about a lot of editors. We're talking about authors in the range from 55 for Timber Volume 2 and 60 for Volume 1. The vast majority of the authors for the PROTA timbers are African authors, African nationals. And then in red you see that there were some wood anatomists involved. I'm a wood anatomist, so that's why I put that in red, and I will explain why that got such a special attention. And we used illustrators as well. That's only the tip of the iceberg, those 1,200 timber species used or described in the timber volumes. There are another 1,100 species whose primary use as a tree is not for timber production, but for instance, medicinal barks, as a fruit tree, as an ornamental tree, etc. And these trees and their timber properties are dealt with in under other commodity groups. Now here you see in red which commodity groups have been finished and published before the money ran out. Plant Resources of Tropical Africa, the organization, was heavily funded by the European Union development money. The stakeholder countries in Africa co-funded it. And the last 5 years, Bill Gates has given a very major subsidy to especially treat the medicinal plants, of which there are thousands. But Bill Gates has withdrawn has finished his funding as well. I must say this is a shame. It's a great shame because this is really a product crossing over from pure science to anything applied which is relevant for all countries in this region. But because by nature these sort of projects take at least 20-25 years to complete, it's very difficult to keep the funding for such a project sexy, so to speak. So all the major funders are interested to join a hype which lasts in this fast and rapid world for not more than 4 or 5 years, and then they want to fund something else. And so really important projects like this are suffer the cost. Now, you probably can't read that, so I will read it for you. On each major timber species, we included information on the names, the taxonomy of the group, their synonyms, their chromosome numbers, their geographical distribution, uses, production and international trade, properties, adulterations and substitutes you can expect to encounter in the trade, botanical description, very full, beautiful description of the tree and its flowers and leaves, the wood anatomy, growth and development, ecology, propagation and planting, silvicultural management, diseases and pests, harvesting, genetic resources, prospects, and a lot of literature you can be directed to for further details. So here just an example of perhaps one of the most famous African timbers, African mahogany, Kaya grandifolia from tropical West Africa. But if you cross the street here in the botanical garden, there's only one big tree that has a name label on it. That's also an African mahogany, but it's another species. Here we are talking about high-value timber yielding a price of more than $500 per cubic meter. I must say that when I talk about mahoganies, I always get a bit nostalgic. When I was a young starting wood anatomist in 1970, I went to a UFRO meeting in Hamburg where the late Professor Gottwald, a great wood scientist, gave a survey of the supplies of mahoganies in the world. And in 1970, he acknowledged that the classical true mahoganies from the Caribbean and South America were running out. They were really getting so rare and expensive that they would not be available for much longer. Never not to worry, Professor Gottwald said, because tropical West Africa is still full of African mahoganies, the Kayas, the Antandrophragmas, you name them. And so, and don't you worry at all, because the whole of Southeast Asia the lights are going out now. The whole of Southeast Asia is full with Dipterocarpaceae forests, the so-called, what they were calling then the Philippine mahoganies or the Marantis. Now, less than 45 years later, we know that the mahoganies in Africa are highly endangered, that most of the Dipterocarpaceae in Southeast Asia are getting very rare and are even being considered as a whole family, the dominant tree family of Southeast Asia, to be CITES listed. So in 2 short generations, mankind has managed to deplete its tropical forests in an abominable way. And I hope that our World Wood Day and our World Forestry Day will help to raise awareness that we must do something about it, because it is not difficult to do something about it, but it requires investment and political choice. Sorry, that was a personal aside about mahoganies. Now, with the help of Prota, and this is all terribly paradoxical, because I've just said, be very careful with your timbers. But with that information that Prota provides, it identifies promising species, appropriate technology, knowledge gaps, research needs, and conservation of the status of species. But that also means that if your mahoganies run out, if you read our timber volumes well, you can say, then we move on to that timber that looks very alike, and we can use it as a substitute, which if we can do sustainably, but the danger is, of course, that you do it just as unsustainably as we treated the mahoganies. So here we just see 2 African woods, Niangon and African whitewood. These are threatened in many parts of their distribution area, and with the information of Prota, you can say, but this similar light wood, Alstonia boonii, can be used as an alternative. But don't cut them all down yet. Now, we are here at a wood culture meeting, and this is to train your eyes. I have just gone through the wood use chapters of many of these descriptions, and I stopped when I had listed 100 uses, and I had to use my dictionary from time to time because I didn't know what a balafon was. Is there anyone in this audience who knows what a balafon was? It's a xylophone-like instrument made of wood, and it's indigenous in Burkina Faso and an adjacent country. But Hans Beekman, who will talk more about wood culture, probably knows everything. But you don't have to read this. I had made a note that when you are reading this, I could perhaps take a sip of water, but there's no water. It would be nice if there would be some water for the next speakers, because we're drying out here. However, if you try to group those uses in very general categories, like miscellaneous construction purposes, and this is heavy and light construction, anything, then you will find that all, Julia, you're so kind. Thank you very much. And by definition, every tree that is called a timber tree is used one way or another for construction, so that's 100%. Furniture, 70% of all the timbers dealt with are used in one place or another for indoor or outdoor furniture. Fuel and charcoal, terribly, terribly important. It says here, documented in the Prota volume, 51%, but I spoke to one of our Tanzanian hosts here who told me that 97% of the timber resource in Tanzania is still used for fuel wood. So then I'm sure that if you really would identify every piece of wood that goes into firewood, you would also end up with 100% of all. Even the very, very expensive timbers are used for charcoal and fuel production. And interestingly, this is a wood culture symposium, 31% is used for wood carving. And I'm really looking forward to future talks in this conference, because we know that there's a lot of selection and intimate knowledge of tree species and timber species of traditional wood uses for religious or ornamental purposes is around, but still 30% can be used or is actively being used for wood carving, ranging the whole property range from very light to very heavy wood. And we've just seen that range displayed in the wood carving demonstration outdoors. Now, anatomy is a special case, because if you summarize the anatomy from the literature, you end up with a lot of uncomparable, unstandardized inventories of properties. And the purpose of including wood anatomy in the proto-volumes was to really have a tool for identification of commercial timbers, microscopic identification that could be used to help legal the legal regulations of timber protection and international trade. So we did that. ITTO sponsored both in the Southeast Asian project, the Prosier Timbers, and for Prota, 2 workshops where junior African wood scientists received a very intensive training on the job by a group of international senior wood anatomists, and that after 2 days of brainwashing to recognize wood features, they would each describe about 20 species. We had microscope slides from Madison, from Leiden, from Tervuren, from Kew, from all over the place. And that was really described, checked, double-checked, and put in a database for interactive computer-assisted identification. I'm very proud that I was together with Nedevoto Molel and Hans Beekman, that we were involved in this project. And of course, if you're a wood anatomist, you don't need to be a wood carver, because looking at microscopic patterns of wood is so beautiful, so it is great fun to do that. Here you see the team in the first workshop in Montpellier. The second workshop was given in Kumasi. And where do we find, there's Hans, oh well, far left, back row, Hans Beekman, front central, Nedevoto, from this country. And I'm somewhere in the back. Here we are enjoying an excursion, because it was really such hard work that we were brought to this Roman Pont du Gard in the south of France. And these are the standards we used. I brought them with me. And just like the wood carvers who are selling some of their finished wood carvings to us here, I'm also prepared to sell copies for a very special reduced price of these IAWA hardwood and softwood microscopic character lists, because they are really, really useful to set standards for computer-assisted wood identification. Then, apart from our own Prota database, these data were immediately uploaded in the worldwide database Inside Wood, which is maintained in Raleigh, North Carolina, by our good friend Professor Elizabeth Wheeler, who sends her greetings to everyone here. And so we know that there are thousands and thousands of users who visit this website, even in the Vatican, as we speak, when Pope Franciscus is being or holds his first mass. Probably one of the curators in the Vatican Museum is trying to identify a splinter of wood with the Inside Wood database. And we don't always need microscopes to identify wood, and just to test whether you are asleep or not, I want you to look at this slide and see whether you can tell the Annonaceae family apart from the Anacardiaceae on the basis of their hand-lens patterns. Who dares to speak out? Can you see the difference? Can you see the difference between the left hand and the right hand side? And what is that difference? That's not a good character, Maria. Sorry? It's the parenchyma distribution, which is always so scalariform in the Annonaceae and quite variable and not so spectacular in the other family. But I need to go on and don't lose the time. Now, why is wood identification so important? I already mentioned that we want to help implementation of international or national legal measures to protect timber. And there are a number of laws, the Vlecht law of the European Union, Forest Law Enforcement, Government and Trade, which tackles illegal logging and supports good governance in timber-producing countries. Well, if people are trespassing on that those rules and regulations, you can simply identify the protected timber and unmask it as an illegal log if you identify its species. The Lacey Act in the US does something similar. Then we have the IUCN Red List of endangered species that does not have a legal status, but any country that wants to really protect its forests and its endangered species makes use of it. And of course we have the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. And CITES is of course very famous, or perhaps even notorious in this part of the world, because especially products like ivory tusks of elephants are subject to that legislation. IAWA, and again, I can offer you some copies at a highly reduced price, 2 years ago staged a workshop specially on wood science for promoting legal timber harvest. And we also included an atlas of CITES-listed timber species in that special issue. And strangely enough, only 2 species from Africa are on that list. One of them is Prunus africana, the African cherry. That's not even a major timber species, but that is highly endangered because it has a medicinal bark and is over-harvested for that purpose. And Pericopsis alata, that's the so-called African teak. It's, as we speak, the Conference of the Parties of the CITES Convention has just finished a meeting in Bangkok and has now listed a number of extra African species, African sandalwood from Kenya and from Madagascar, all the rosewoods, which are heavily over-harvested there, and the ebonies. And I must say, when I see all our friends carving in ebony outdoors, once a substantial number of species of ebonies is on the CITES list, their livelihoods will be affected because transboundary traffic of ebony sculptures will then be illegal. And of course it's terribly, terribly important to protect the ebonies because they are terribly slow growing, and over-harvesting will lead to their final demise very rapidly. But it just shows you how complex the problem is and in what sort of a different type of interest groups we are involved in this World Wood Day Symposium. Anyway, the customs officers in the Netherlands, whom I've taught how to identify wood microscopically, will know to recognize an African cherry when they see it, or an African teak when they see it. Sue, how much time have I been talking? Because I don't have a chairperson. I'm almost finished, right? Yes. So here are the extra new CITES listings. I will go very briefly with that. Apart from wood identification, you can do a lot of interesting science with wood anatomy, like reconstructing the evolution in a family like the soapberry family, as we did. We can study the relationship between environment and wood anatomy and use that information for understanding and predicting the effects of climate change, like we have done, of course, extensively with growth rings in temperate regions, but which now, with new insights, we can do with rainfall patterns in tropical regions. So wood anatomy is a fantastic field to be associated with. I want to thank Roel Lemmens and Elizabeth Wheeler. I want to invite you all, if you are interested in wood anatomy and you are not yet a member of the International Association of Wood Anatomists, to join. I have brought some application forms with me, and here are the publications you can order from us. This takes 10 seconds. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. It takes more than 10 seconds. I'm sorry. But I will leave you with my final message, that if we look at this tree in one of my favorite holiday islands in Greece, a country in distress just like Prota, but sometimes you see these trees of love, and sometimes you see a tap with water streaming out of it, and it's also a tree of life. And wood anatomists, and I think all wood carvers and wood scientists, make love, not war. I thank you very much.